Hi everyone. This week we are starting week 2 of our Mindfulness and Self-Compassion course, and we're going to be talking about the benefits of self-compassion and the physiology of self-criticism and self-compassion. But before we jump right into this week's topics, let's go ahead and review a little bit from what you guys went over last week. So in week 1, you guys did chapter 1 and chapter 2 in your workbook. That was your assignment. And so the things that you would have gone over is what is self-compassion, and then what is not self-compassion as a base as we continue on this semester to really be able to understand the concepts of what we are talking about. So just to review really quick, when we are talking about self-compassion, essentially what we are talking about is treating yourself the way that you would treat a friend. If you had a friend who was struggling or who was hurting, specifically for those of you who are social work majors and are choosing to go into a helping profession, you typically are going to lead with kindness, right? With lack of judgment whenever you are approaching your friend or you are helping your friend or you are looking at a situation. We need to be able to treat ourselves in that same exact way. We have a really big focus in our culture of kindness and empathy towards other people, and yet when it comes to ourselves, we're often very harsh, very critical. We place a lot of judgment on ourselves. And so self-compassion is a practice, it is a discipline in how we are learning to be good friends to ourselves. We are learning to be a loyal partner to ourselves so that rather than being our own worst critic, we can be our kindest ally. You guys would have gone over that there are 3 core elements of self-compassion, and those elements are self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. So when we're talking about self-kindness, we are essentially talking about caring towards being caring towards ourselves like we are to others, being supportive, being encouraging, and being protective of ourselves, and then also accepting ourselves, being accepting of who we are in our moment, being accepting of what we view to be failures or flaws in our own lives, and leading with that type of kindness whenever we are dealing with ourselves. Common humanity is really focused on this idea of a sense of interconnectedness and recognizing that all humans are flawed, everyone fails and makes mistakes. Life entails suffering for everyone without exception. Oftentimes, whenever we are going through hard times, it's really easy to feel isolated. So this idea of common humanity helps us to see that we are all more connected than we realize. And then the third element is mindfulness, where you are aware of your moment-to-moment experience without resistance or avoidance. Whenever we are approaching things with mindfulness, we are facing the truth of our experiences without putting up any type of barrier or any type of wall. We are being aware, being open to the reality of the present moment, allowing every single thought, every single emotion, every single sensation to enter without being judgmental of ourselves, without trying to necessarily fix it in that moment, but just letting ourselves be aware and bringing that awareness and mindfulness to kind of the forefront. And so if you want to look at another way of describing those 3 essential elements of self-compassion, we would call it a loving, connected presence. The loving portion being that self-kindness, that connected portion being our common humanity, and presence being the mindfulness. Loving, connected presence. So when we are in the mind state of loving, connected presence, our relationship with ourselves, our relationship to other people, our relationship to the world is going to change and it's going to become healthier. We are going to create emotional well-being for ourselves. And so in chapter 2, you guys reviewed what self-compassion is not, okay? Self-compassion is not self-pity. Self-compassion is not selfish. Self-compassion is not self-indulgent, and it does not mean that you are making excuses for what we would consider to be any type of poor behavior or anything like that. Whenever we are leading with self-compassion, it does not mean that we have low standards. Oftentimes, the most self-compassionate people have very high personal standards. What self-compassion is a way of relating to who you are with kindness and acceptance. It's not a judgment of a situation or an evaluation of that situation. It is simply a way of being with yourself and making sure that at all times kindness and acceptance are leading the way. Otherwise, that's how we tend to get into situations where we find ourselves struggling with the same issue over and over and over again, or dealing with the same things over and over and over again, and not really knowing how to move out of that. It's easy to find ourselves leading with judgment rather than kindness and acceptance. So self-compassion, it's not having self-pity. It's not being selfish. It's not saying I don't care about these areas in my life that need wellness or that need to change. It's saying that I am going to relate to myself at all times with kindness and acceptance, and let that be the benchmark for how I treat myself and for how I engage with my own life. Okay, so this week you guys are doing chapter 3 and chapter 4 in your workbook. And chapter 3 talks about the benefits of self-compassion. So we can look at the research, we can look at what is already out there, evidence-based research, and we can know that people who are more self-compassionate typically experience a greater well-being, which means that their emotional health, their spiritual health, oftentimes their physical health, their social and relational health is going to be greater. They're going to find that they have more joy in their lives, more satisfaction. So you can see, and this is in your workbook, that people who are self-compassionate typically have less depression, anxiety, stress, and shame in their lives, while they often have greater happiness, life satisfaction, self-confidence, and physical health. There are actual things that happen in your body that we'll talk about whenever you lead with self-compassion that can produce health, that can produce happiness for you. But the path to true self-compassion often begins with an objective assessment of ourselves. We can't just say we want to be self-compassionate. We actually have to evaluate and look and see, how self-compassionate am I really? Am I showing myself self-kindness, or do I show myself judgment? Do I have a sense of common humanity, or do I feel isolated by imperfection? Am I mindful of my suffering, or do I over-identify with my suffering? And this is really important that we know and understand kind of our benchmark for how self-compassionate we already are, and that we can have that objective assessment of ourselves so that we know what are the areas where we could really become more compassionate. The good thing about self-compassion is that it's a skill, it is a discipline, it is a practice. The more you practice it, the easier it will become. So if you feel like you probably have a low benchmark score for self-compassion, the good news is that over time, if you start to implement daily practices, that's going to grow, and it will happen for you, and you will find that you are leading with kindness. You will find that you are able to have a greater sense of that interconnectedness. You will find that you are able to be more mindful at all times, and you're not just going with the motions, and the days aren't slipping away, and you don't feel like you are just kind of floating through life, but you have that greater awareness and a greater mindful presence of what is happening in your life. If you guys look in your workbook, you are going to see that there is a self-compassionate exercise, and it actually gives you a scale that you can use where you can answer a few questions and score yourself and see what your self-compassion score is. And again, it is really important that you know kind of your benchmark, because you're not able to move forward unless you know what your baseline is. Okay, so let's talk about the physiology of self-criticism and self-compassion. We know that when we criticize ourselves, we are tapping into the body's threat defense system. Okay? Our bodies perceive danger when we are critical. When we are not connected to ourselves in a kind and loving way, we're actually making our bodies perceive us as a threat. And so what happens is that because our threat defense system evolved so that when we perceive a threat, the part in your brain that registers danger gets activated, your body will start to release hormones. Your body releases cortisol and your body releases adrenaline, and that's what puts us into that fight, flight, or freeze place. And that's not a good space to be in all the time. So here's the thing. There are legitimate moments in life where we are in danger, where our bodies need to detect danger. Our brains need to perceive a threat. But if we are living in that constant response because we are so self-critical, we are leaving our bodies unregulated. We are staying in a state of emotional unregulation, and we are keeping ourselves in that constant fight, flight, or freeze. So our bodies are just producing these stress hormones, and that can lead to a lot of problems. That puts extra stress on the mind and the body. That type of chronic stress can lead to anxiety, it can lead to depression, it can lead to actual physical health problems. So we actually have research that shows us that habitual self-criticism is bad for our emotional and physical well-being. It is harmful to who we are to experience constant criticism from our own self over and over and over again like that. What happens is that normally when we experience some sense of danger, there's an actual predator. There's something that we know to be afraid of. But when we are in a state of constant self-criticism, we actually become that predator to ourselves. We become both the attacker and the attacked. And that is very, very harmful for who we are. But here's something else that we also know. We know that we are kind of created to care, to have some type of care system. So whenever that care system within our bodies is activated, then our bodies start to produce good hormones. We produce oxytocin. We produce endorphins. Endorphins are those natural feel-good opiates. And what that does is it helps reduce stress and it increases our own feelings of safety and of security. So your book, when you read this chapter, it's chapter 4, it gives some really good examples of animals in the wild and how they care for their young and how they care for themselves. And so we can see that that type of compassion, including self-compassion, is linked to that type of care system. That is why being compassionate to ourselves when we feel inadequate makes us feel safe and cared for, because it's that kind of natural state of being within that care system where we know that we are being nurtured, even if we're doing that to ourselves. So because of that, self-compassion then helps to downregulate that threat response that we are feeling. So when the stress response, which is your fight, flight, or freeze, which we talked about on the other slide, is triggered by a threat to our self-concept, then we're likely to turn on ourselves. And so that's where we get self-criticism. That's where we will isolate. We might push people away. We might feel like we are alone in what we are going through. We might freeze, which is rumination. But these three reactions are the opposite of the three components of self-compassion that we've already talked about: self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. So you can see in this table the relationship of the stress response to self-compassion. So our stress response is fight. But when we are leading with self-compassion, then that turns into self-kindness. If the stress response is flight, when we are leading with self-compassion, then our response is common humanity. If your stress response is freeze, when you are leading with self-compassion, then that's going to look like mindfulness. So rather than having these negative stress responses of self-criticism, isolation, and rumination, leading with self-compassion is how we engage those three core pieces of self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. So when we practice self-compassion, we are deactivating the threat defense system and we're activating that care system. And the safer that you feel, the more open and flexible that you can be in response to your own environment. And that is why it is so important, because we cannot always control our external variables. We cannot control everything that is happening. But what we can control through practice, through habit, through discipline, is whether or not we feel safe and cared for from ourselves, or whether or not our bodily response to our own self-criticism is that of someone being attacked. We don't want to be the predator in our own lives. We want to be that loving, gentle friend. We want to be a good, kind, and loyal partner to ourselves, because essentially that is what we are. And so we can see here through the science and through the research that self-compassion can lead to better health outcomes. It can lead to greater levels of happiness. It can lead to more awareness. It can lead to a healthier way of engaging the world around you. And it can lead to more confidence and just a better life satisfaction at the end of the day. Okay, so if you guys are looking in your workbooks, you're going to see that you've been given some informal practices that you can do that go along with these two chapters of the benefits of self-compassion and then the physiology of self-criticism and self-compassion. Okay, the first one is a self-compassion journal. So essentially what that means is that you would write a journal entry every day for at least a week. If you want to do it longer, you can do it longer. Journaling has been a proven effective way to express your emotions. And what you would do is in the evenings, as you're kind of reviewing what happened that day, you were going to write down anything that you felt bad about, anything that you judged yourself for, any difficult experience that caused you pain. So if you were rude to somebody, if someone was rude to you, the example that your book gives, if you got angry at the wait staff at a restaurant and you made a rude comment, or you stormed off without leaving a tip, and then anything that made you feel shame afterward, or that made you feel bad, or that made you kind of lead with judgment for yourself, you're going to write those things down, okay? For every difficult event that happened during the day, what you're then going to do is try mindfulness, try a sense of common humanity, or try kindness to relate to the event in a more self-compassionate way, okay? So if you're leading with mindfulness, what you're going to be doing is bringing a balanced awareness to the emotions that arose during your self-judgment or difficult circumstances. So write down about how you felt, or write about how you felt. So did you feel sad? Did you feel ashamed? Did you feel stressed? And then as you write, try to be accepting and non-judgmental of your experience without diminishing it or without becoming like super dramatic about it, okay? Common humanity is you're writing down the ways in which your experience was part of being a human and part of just being a person who goes through regular life things. And then self-kindness, write yourself some kind, understanding words, much like what you would write a friend who maybe had a bad day. Let yourself know that you care about your own happiness and well-being, and that it's okay, and that you can try again tomorrow. So the goal in keeping a self-compassion journal is that you would be able to document this practice of leading with compassion and then seeing if you've noticed any changes in your internal dialogue, because that is what we ultimately want to get to where our internal dialogue is one of kindness and mindfulness and gentleness and common humanity. Okay? There are also some other activities in the physiology of self-criticism and self-compassion chapter. One of them being soothing touch, which is essentially figuring out what touch you need to feel safe and to feel comforted, okay? Where you are actually practicing your own physical touch that creates sense of comfort, okay? Then there's just a self-compassion break, and then compassionate movement. I'm not going to go over those too much. All of these you can read about in your book. So with your discussion board post this week, you are going to pick an informal practice and implement it at some point during the week. Even if you don't journal for every single day, or even if it's just kind of a one-time thing that you implement one of these practices, and then you're going to share about that experience in your post. Okay, so guys, this was chapter 3 and chapter 4, the benefits of self-compassion and the physiology of self-criticism and self-compassion. Okay, as always, please reach out. Please email me if you have any questions. I will be sending out an email that lets you know a few more details about what's going to be going on in our course this week. And so please just make sure that you are completing the workbook activities, that you are picking an informal practice to implement, and that you're documenting that experience. Okay? Well, that is all. So I will talk to you guys later.